I wanted to go through today. We're going to talk specifically about Sharp's expertise for medical devices and how sharp do you really need to get your products as you get them into the market. So an overview, I think this discussion, at least my presentation part, will probably take 20-25 minutes or so. But the things that I'd like to cover is Sharp's expertise. How did we actually get it as a company? So you'll hear a little bit about who we are and how we got Sharp's expertise. Who is Cadence today? That'll be pretty brief, but it'll give you an overview of what we've grown into over the last years. And then really into the heart of the discussion, the technical discussion on what is sharpness, how is sharpness measured, and then how do we as a company get parts sharp? And not only how do we get them sharp, but it's very important to also focus on how do you keep the parts sharp throughout the manufacturing and assembly process. So, how do we get where we are today? Our company was actually founded as a company called Specialty Blades back in 1985. So that we celebrated our 35-year anniversary actually 2 days ago. Our company was started by this gentleman here, Martin Lightsey, who was an engineer. And Martin worked at a company that made razor blades for a living. High volume, standard razor blades used for shaving and industrial applications. And Martin was managing their industrial blade business and got many requests for specialty blades. So Martin invented a way to actually take razor blade manufacturing processes and marry those processes with what was new at the time, CNC technology. So our company was started 35 years ago, basically with one machine that we designed and built to do specialty type blades that were made out of different materials and had very different edge configurations than a standard razor blade had. So 1985, we started, a few of us. That young guy in the middle is the same old man that's speaking today. One machine, one vision and hope for trying to sell parts into a new market. But then after a few years, after 20 years, we actually acquired a company that did needles for a living. So Popper and Sons was a company that had been around since 1922, and they spent much of their time making specialty medical and veterinary needles for laboratory specialties and things of that nature. So we acquired a company that did needles after being a blade company for 20 some years. So if you say Sharp's expertise, how did we get it? We grew it as a blade company. We bought it through acquisition as a needle company. So we have almost 100 years of needle experience, and that's coupled with about 35 years of blade experience. We've also had the opportunity to actually be awarded a couple of patents for novel sharpening processes that we've developed along the way. So our company has grown quite a bit over the years. It's now called Cadence, and we are a full service contract manufacturer of medical devices. 5 locations, all in the US at this point, but we continue to grow. So current turnover on an annual basis is about $100 million in revenue. We have 501 employees. And the other thing I would say is, as we've grown, we've continued to add engineering talent. So today we have about 76 engineers. The gentleman who started our company was an engineer. I'm an engineer by degree. Our CFO, our CEO are all also engineers. So we have a very technical approach to actually supplying full service contract manufacturing services across the medical device industry. The other thing I would say is our medical device business is 75 to 80% of our current turnover. So it's a high percentage of our current focus as a company. So let's get into some of the details. What is sharpness? This is pretty easy. I think we all have a fairly common understanding of what sharpness actually is, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. But the dictionary would say having a thin cutting edge or a fine point that is well adapted for cutting and piercing. So I've tried to show some higher resolution images of cutting blades and of the needle tips that we'll be talking about in the next few minutes. So that's what sharpness is. I think we can all agree on that. The important thing for us to try to communicate is, so how do you measure sharpness? We get this question asked every day. And as we try to break down the very common elements of how to do this, we put it into two buckets, basically. The one bucket is take physical measurements of the parts, which is pretty typical. We'll talk about the drawings and what the dimensions are and how those parts are physically measured. And then there's a part two, which is actually functional testing, where we try to adapt testing methods that most accurately reflect the part in the actual end use. So we do physical measurements and we do functional testing. So what I wanted to do is drill into each of those in a little more detail, starting with the physical measurements. So if we just take a look at a standard needle tip used in medical devices, this is how the geometry would be reflected on a normal drawing. You'd have dimensions and you'd have tolerances, and you define the bevel widths along with the side point length and some angles also. So the first way to get physical measurements done accurately is to reflect what you want on a drawing and then measure parts as you produce them to that particular drawing. So this is a typical view for a medical point cannula that we make every day. The complementary piece of this in the world of cutting blades, if you say, how do you do it for a blade versus a needle? If you look at a cross section of the cutting edge of a blade itself, what we have to do is translate those geometries into a drawing. So what I show here in the middle is how we normally, on a typical sharpened edge, we would specify a grind angle, which is a lower angle that's put down first to remove a lot of the material, and then a hone angle, which is a secondary bevel that's added right out at the cutting edge itself. It's typically done with a finer grit, more polished wheel. And so in addition to the hone bevel width, we also measure the hone angle. So these are the dimensions when we do a blade drawing for grind and hone angles. We will specify accordingly, and then we will end up measuring these angles to the print as we produce parts. So we've talked a little bit about needle tips, what those geometries might typically look like, blade angles. And then the next thing that is a little unique to the world of sharps is, okay, how do you measure these angles that we're talking about? So in terms of physical measurements, it's critical that we use methods that are non-contact, where you don't touch the edge. So typical ways to do this is using what we call a goniometer. There's a laser goniometer that's shown here on the left, and there's also a microscope goniometer that's shown on the right. And the process that's used here for the laser goniometer, the blade is mounted, blade or needle is mounted in a device, and we shine a laser beam down along the tip, and you get reflected light around the measurement scale that's on the angular grid here. So this is a laser process. There's also a similar process that's used where the part can be mounted in a microscope, and as the part is rotated around, reflected light coming down through the microscope reflects back up. And when the brightest light is reflecting, you can actually read what the angle is on the goniometer. So these are pretty unique and specialized ways for sharps that people would measure the angular measurements. And I would also refer up here in the right corner, there's a good resource in the UK. It's called CATRA. It's an organization that was really developed around the cutlery trades, you know, kitchen knives and things of that nature. But over the years, CATRA has added many types of applications, and some of which support blades and needles that might be used in medical devices. So we've gone through blade drawings, needle drawings, some goniometer ways to actually measure the angles without contacting them. And there's one more level of detail that is available that we use quite often. Many times we will go down to the finest level that we can look at the edges, and that's using very high powered microscopes. And we can actually measure the edge radius on a cutting edge. So what I show here on the left is when you have a small radius, these are cross sections of a cutting blade. And when you have a small radius right at the edge, it means the part is going to be very sharp. And the larger the radius is at the edge, the more dull the blade's going to be. So we have capabilities to measure the actual finest features at the edges and compare products accordingly. And what I've done on the right side here is try to give you some comparisons. Everyone is familiar with the Swiss Army knife. If you measure the edge radius of a Swiss Army knife, it's going to look something like this picture on the right corner, which has a more rounded edge. And the edge radius is going to be somewhere in the 0.2 to 0.25 micrometers. So it's a fairly large edge radius. And then as you get sharper, as the edge radiuses get smaller, there's a blade that many people are familiar with. It's used in many industrial applications, a single edge blade. It might have a 0.15 to 0.20 edge radius. You can see the edge actually looks sharper than the pocket knife. Let me go back. Sorry. The pocket knife radius is much larger than the single edge radius. Scalpel blades actually are sharper than the single edge blades. They have a 0.1, approximately a 0.1 micrometer edge radius. And then the sharpest parts that we have found over time are parts like diamond blades and microtome blades that are used to take very thin sections of tissue for testing. And these have a very sharp edge, but they have very low durability because the edge is so sharp. So what I wanted to show here is the finest physical measurements that we can do actually get down to micrometers along the cutting edges. And we can compare pocket knives to microtome blades. So that's the physical measurements. That's an overview of half of what we go through in terms of measuring sharpness. The other half, part two, is actually functional testing. And this is what I wanted to show here are two very typical approaches that we use to do functional testing. I'll start with the blade. So the typical cut force testing setup is one where a blade is mounted in a fixture and the blade travels vertically through a media. In this case, you can see in the picture, it's actually a string, and the string is clamped on one end and it goes around a pulley, and we place a weight for constant tension. So there's a media that has constant tension, and a blade is pushed at a programmable feed rate through that string, and we measure the peak force that's actually used to cut the string. And so that's a pretty typical cut force testing setup for a blade. There's a related test that I'm showing on the right where we use a similar thing where it's a load cell with a programmable feed rate, and the needle travels down through a media, and we measure the forces through the load cell as it travels through the media. And what you'll find when you take measurements is there'll be an initial peak force as the needle enters the media. That force will increase until you get past the side bevels, and the force will be the highest as the total needle has entered the media. So these are, I just wanted to show, and most of these end up being optimized for specific devices or testing media that we get input from our customers on. But these are two typical tests where you take a part and you try to get a functional readout for how sharp it is. And you can compare one blade to a competitor's blade and so on, and double check the results. So here's the testing output for a typical cut force test for a blade. We took 4 blades and we did a cut force test with the lowest peak. The lowest force was blade number 2 here, specimen number 2, had the lowest cut force. And then there were a couple of parts that were in intermediate parts. And then there was one sample, number 4, that had the highest peak force to cut through the media, which would translate to the dullest blade. So we can talk about this for a long time. I just wanted to bring it up in terms of how do you measure sharpness. We actually have an Incision lab, which is a dedicated space that we use for doing this testing and measurements. And we work with customers every day on how to measure the sharpness, how can they lower penetration force, how can they differentiate their product maybe from a competitor's product. So in this lab, we have very detailed measurement capability and testing capability. We can do the high resolution 3D color imaging that you see over here on the right, which shows very fine features of parts. And this allows us, we can go up to 24,000x in terms of magnification, which is very high powered analysis. So we've talked about sharpness. We've talked about how do you measure it, the physical dimensions, and then the functional testing. The other piece that I wanted to go into is, okay, that's fine. I kind of understand that, but how do we as a company actually get parts sharp? So my main point here is we as a company, we don't just buy commercial grinders and use them to sharpen parts. Our company was founded on the capability to do very unique sharpening processes. So we design and build our own sharpening equipment. And this allows us to actually provide different sharpening geometries that can be found very few other places in the world. So in the middle of the bottom of the screen, this is a 9-axis sharpening machine that's actually in our Virginia location. And on the left is some needle sharpening capability that we have in our Rhode Island facility here in the US. So this is not just buy a machine and get sharp parts. We actually create our own machines so that we can generate the sharpness that's required in the actual application. So that's how we get the part sharp. The last thing I wanted to talk about, which is actually many times left out in discussions, and we talk about it every day. It's critical to get parts sharp. It's as critical to keep those parts sharp after you've done the sharpening. So there are many organizations like the FDA, the CDC, OSHA. There are lots of information out there about what kind of damage that sharps can do to people when they're mishandled. There's lots of sharps handling techniques for doctors, nurses, sharps containers, things like that. So there's a lot of worry and concern about what sharps can do to people. I want to talk just for a minute about the flip side of that, because we focus our efforts on what people can actually do to sharps, okay? And this has to do with after the sharpening process, the things you do with handling and things of that nature can actually damage the sharps, just like people can get hurt. Well, the sharps can also get damaged. So what we've done as a company is we've actually put together a free guide. It's a one-pager that outlines a lot of details about how to keep parts sharp throughout the manufacturing process and assembly process. We did this because we fight problems every day where companies have not done the due diligence to assure that sharpness is maintained after it's been created. So we will actually send you a link to this free guide after the presentation today. And we'll also send you a copy of the presentation also, so you will have it for reference. But I wanted to go down through some of these so that everyone can at least hear how important they are. Any material that comes in contact with the needle tips or cutting edges can cause damage. A lot of people don't understand that. If you contact that cutting edge after you've created it or the needle tip, you might bend the tip, you might damage the edge. All of the inspection techniques we use need to be non-contact measurement. You should not ever touch the tips mechanically with some type of measuring tool. We find quite often people don't understand that. They measure it like they measure other metal parts. So tooling, a lot of times if you're doing overmolding operations or welding operations, you need to provide large areas of relief for the sharpened areas or needle tips to make sure that none of these parts are touched in these areas while they're in the tooling. Work instructions for loading and unloading, they need to highlight the importance that you can't touch the edges and you need to protect the edges. And most importantly, if a part is dropped or does come in contact with another surface, we recommend that part should be either scrapped or re-inspected for goodness before it's moved to the subsequent operations. So there's a lot of thought that everyone needs to put into keeping parts sharp after they've actually been sharpened. And finally, material handling carriers. If you have trays, things of that nature where the parts are being moved from one process to another, or shipping containers, all of those packaging methods, final packaging, needs to protect the cutting edges and make sure that there is no damage along the way. And finally, it's quite typical that there are coatings that are applied to needles or blades. There's either coating processes or electropolishing processes. So coating processes are typically additive processes where you can see on the right image here where a coating has been applied to a blade edge. And it was a very sharp edge, but the edge radius gets to be very big after you add a thick coating on it. So coating thickness is an additive process that can dull edges. And the other piece is electropolishing. Electropolishing is actually a subtractive process. So that can actually remove material around the cutting edge itself or the needle tip and dull the tips accordingly. So that was the kind of the final thoughts I wanted everyone to take away is you can understand sharpness, you can understand how to measure it through physical means and through some functional testing. You get a feel for how we can actually sharpen parts and get them sharp, but you really also have to focus on keeping them sharp after the sharpening processes. Final assembly processes are very subject to having damage to sharps as they're put in and out of the final assembly process. So that's those are the key points I wanted to go through today. What is sharpness? How it's measured, physical measurements, some functional testing. How do we get parts sharp? And then ultimately, how do we keep them sharp? So with that, Mark, I guess I can turn it back over to you, and we can maybe allow a few minutes for some questions if anyone has them.